Okay, so today I am covering chapter 6, which is development, and we're that much closer into seeing or working with HTML. And we're gonna start some HTML after next week, because next week is the exam, and then we're gonna start HTML. Okay, so development. What do you need to do when you have development? Well, you need a staff. You need people to do the development. So there's different staffing styles. There's, of course, a single developer, which means that you're basically doing it on your own. And of course, there's benefits and then there's downfalls. The benefits is that, well, you created the entire program or all the web pages, so you know everything. You know everything and where it is, and that's great. You don't have to agree on coding styles or what code you use, what functions you use, what everything is called. You don't have to compromise. Everything is what you want it to be. The downfall is specifically when you start programming, and even when you're doing HTML, like you have to be really detail oriented. So that means that every angle bracket, every semicolon, every period, with other programming languages, you have semicolons and periods, but for HTML, it's angle brackets. Well, I guess there are quotes and there are semicolons too. So little characters like that mean a lot. So if you're missing one little character, it's going to mess everything up if you've done programming before. So it's sometimes it can be really frustrating when you just can't find the problem and it's only because of a semicolon or you forgot a quote. So having a second pair of eyes when you're working with somebody else actually helps you find issues or bugs. Bugs are basically errors that you have in the code, but they call it bugs. And you call it debugging to get rid of those bugs or errors. So a second pair of eyes will actually help you find those issues. Sometimes, you're staring at code for hours and you just don't know what the problem is. Uh, if you're working by yourself, well, you just want to step away from your code, maybe take a break or something and then come back, because staring at something constantly for hours is typically not going to solve a problem. And that's also a reason why you want to start any sort of programming or even HTML early, so that way you can step away and then come back with fresh eyes, specifically if you're working by yourself as you are with your assignments. Okay, then, and also having a second person, you're only depending on the education and knowledge that you have individually. But if you're working with somebody else, well, that additional information or the stuff that they know that you don't know can help you. For example, security issues. If you don't know something about one security issue with web pages, then the web page can be hacked. So it's good to have, more people so you all can share knowledge and, you could learn off of each other. So I was just talking about downfalls of the single developer, but a paired programming is when you work with another person, and all these downfalls, well, there are advantages for being in a pair again. You have a second pair of eyes. They may know things that you don't, so that's really good. But of course, there's downfalls. Now that I'm on that topic, there's downfalls when it comes to working with somebody else, is that, well, now you have to compromise. You have to discuss, who does what and how you're going to do the program or the web page or even the whole website. You need to work with your coworker. But as long as you get along, then you're able to have, you can actually, organize, well, who does what? I can do this while you do that, or, that kind of thing. But you just have to get along with the person. And You know, we all have to get along with each other. You know, this is a job. You don't want to, you know, take control of everything and just not work with somebody, you know. And I have to say that there's some sort of saying, I'm probably not saying exactly right, but they say that you get hired for your knowledge, but you get fired if you don't have a good attitude. So just keep that in mind, that we all have to have good attitudes and work together. And then, of course, another staffing method would be team development. And, you know, not just one or two people, you have more people, I guess more than two, but depending on the size of your company or the size of your project, depends on how many people you want working together. Okay. Now we're going to look at project management methods. So how do you do the project? And basically what I would focus on in this section here is how fast you get things done. So Agile is the fastest in this section. There's Agile, there's Scrum, and then there's Waterfall. Waterfall would be where you take more time to do a project. And I know that there's different ways of doing projects, but it doesn't mean that you actually have an option typically. Frankly, where I have worked, you know, it's always been a matter of agile working, where you need to get this project done now for whatever reason. So when you're doing the project, you're not, you know, planning everything ahead of time. Let me go ahead and go with look at Waterfall, where you actually have a process. There's a 5-stage approach. It's very organized. First, you determine what the requirements are, then you design the web pages, then you implement it or put it online, then you verify that it does everything okay, and then you have a maintenance where, you know, because things change, so you have to maintain the website. So that is an organized method of doing that, as opposed to, now Scrum would be in between the two, but Agile, you know, you have to do everything quickly. Remember the SMART acronym, where everything, you know, you want to make sure that the information that you get from you know, your boss or whoever wants the website, the information that you get, you want it to be specific, you want it measured, realistic. But when you're doing Agile, you just don't have all the information. You have to work with what they give you. So basically, you're working fast, you're kind of throwing things together, but then you're submitting the work frequently, as it says down here. You're delivering the work frequently, because since you don't know what are the requirements, because they're always changing, that you want to make sure that whatever you're doing, to make sure that they're okay with it. But of course, you know, when people want you to do that kind of work, you know, you're not really, you know, it's hard to stick to a budget when somebody really hasn't even given you everything you need. So it's just not organized. So there's so many different principles of agile development listed here if you read that later on. So anyway, that's just fast. You need to just throw something together, check if they like it, get some more things to do, you know. So anyway, and of course, you may have a preference. You may want to just get started and not sit around in a meeting and discuss, well, now what do we do? Now what do you need? You know, if you think about it, you might think that that might be a little boring to sit around, you know, you're trying to organize it. And you may just want to start just doing something. But, it's not always up to you. You really have to work with what you get. And of course, you're working with the company. You might decide, well, at this company, I don't like, sitting around in meeting rooms all day. I want to work in a company where I can do agile, or maybe you want to do Scrum, where it is fast but it's still organized. So that's just and actually that would be a good interview question. I know that it's always good to practice, and I know that you guys practice, so that might actually be one of the questions. You might say, what kind of development do you do? Do you do agile, Scrum, or waterfall? But to tell you the truth, the employer might not be so familiar with those terms, so you can just ask, how you do projects. Is it more of a where you need a fast turnaround so you can submit work more frequently, or do you go through the 5-stage approach? And it's actually usually what I remember it called is the SDLC, Systems Development Life Cycle, but they don't mention it here for some reason. You can just ask something like, well, how organized are your projects, or do you work fast on your projects? That kind of thing, just to get a feel of what kind of environment that job is, before accepting. Because when you apply for when you apply for jobs, you're applying for different positions, and it really means that not only do you just want to get a job, because, well, yes, we need money, but you also want to get a job that you enjoy, or at least that you can work with. So that's why you apply to many different jobs, so you actually have a choice. So anyway, I need to close my email. Okay. So anyway, and also remember too that I want to throw in that when you do need to do interviews, always remember that you can look online for insight, like what kind of questions are they going to ask, what kind of answers should you give, and even YouTube has videos on interview questions, so that's always a good idea. All right. Okay, so waterfall. We are looking at waterfall, and here are the different, remember there's 5 stages here. And the requirement stage is basically, at the very beginning of the project, you're determining, okay, what are we doing this project for? What are the features? What's the other important information that you need to create this project? Then you're going to go into the design stage, where you're actually designing pseudocode. We'll discuss that later. But you're also doing storyboards and wireframes. So just like we discussed in chapter 5, you're doing the designing of this project. The third phase is actual programming, where you've already designed, you know what you want. So let's go ahead and do that program. Let's write the HTML. Let's write the cascading style sheets and the JavaScript for our web page. That's the implementation part. Then we have the verification, where now that we've written the program, now we need to make sure that it works. So now we need to test it. And remember, I mentioned earlier, bugs are errors. Debugging is getting rid of the errors. So in verification, you're testing and you're getting rid of errors, or debugging. Okay. And the last stage is the maintenance, where, like I mentioned earlier, after you create a system, you tested it, it's actually, your web page is online, people are making orders on your website. That's great, but there's always going to be modifications. So let's say you have a website, it's selling stuff. Well, you're going to be selling new stuff. Things that you sell are going to change. So you need to change those websites, and that's the maintenance. I'm sorry, you're going to change those web pages. And that's the maintenance part of this, this cycle. Okay. Okay, and again, that was waterfall, and that's the organized way of creating web pages or systems, programs, systems, software. Okay, so this next section here is called structural patterns. And basically you determine how to manage the development of the code. And this might be a bit much, but still, this still makes sense in our situation. And there are different variations of the patterns, but the model view controller is basically the approach where you have a controller in the middle, and the view is where, you know, the presentation of, in our case, the website or the web pages, and then the model would be where the data is stored. Now, what do they mean by data? Well, the data would be, let's say we're creating a web page for a bank. Well, the data would be our, you know, the deposits and the money that you're taking out. That's the data. And of course, you know, banks have more information about you, like your name, your address, your phone number, and more. Well, you have the model, which is the data area, and then you have a controller that basically gets the information from the presentation. So you're on a website, let's say you're logging into the bank, you see the bank's website, then there's fields there where you type in your login and your password. Then the controller accepts that information, and then it goes into the database to check if your username matches with that password. And then if it does, well, then it goes through the controller to display your, you know, your opening page of your account. So basically you have your view, whatever you're looking at, the controller that controls what happens in between the presentation and the actual data storage. And then of course the user, you know, views and then interacts with, you know, the controller really. But if you're looking at web pages, generally the web page does both controller and view, because you're viewing it, but after you view and you enter the information, it's really still the web page that interprets the input and then interacts with the data. So, oh, and one thing too is that when you see data storage, always think of a database. And a database is, you know, like Access. You might have already worked with an Access database where it stores information. And it'll store, if it's a bank, it'll store all the information of all the customers and all their accounts and all their income and all of that stuff. That's a database. Okay, so then the text pretty much describes more about the different sections here. Models has the stuff that manipulates the data. It's the data focus. Then we have the views, what is presented to the user. And the view will have the images, tables, styling. You know, that's the web page that we're creating. And then the controller will recognize any changes. So you change the fields on the web page and then you hit submit or log in, and the controller interprets what you've entered and then pulls the data from the model section. And then of course there's variations of that model, and you know, for web development, like I said, the controller and the view, those are generally the same. Okay, then the next section is service-oriented architecture. And SOA is basically a modular style approach to interaction. And what that means is you're going to have like add-ons, really. I mean, if you think about a web page, you know, you've had instances where you've had add-ons to web pages or to your browser, really. You have add-ons where you have your browser, that's your program, but then you're adding some additional capability to that browser. And basically, used in web services, you'd be doing APIs, and we'll cover that in just a second. And again, it's just a method of providing tools, actions, and information that you integrate or you work with the system that you have, like your browser, but you're adding a capability, some sort of function, something in addition to what the browser actually does. And I will give you, oh, actually, I can give you an example right now. Okay, so I am looking at Canvas right here. And you know, Canvas is the website that we log into so we can do our homework and communicate with each other and all that stuff. Okay, but in addition to, you know, doing all that work, we also have a link for Zoom. Now, Zoom is a separate web page that that allows us to communicate online, like video conferencing, but it's not actually part of Canvas. But there's an API that adds the capability of using Zoom within Canvas. And if I go into settings, now this is the instructor view of Canvas. If I go into settings and then click on apps up on top, you can see that there's many different options that I can add to Canvas. And I believe there's one for YouTube. And so then I could, you know, have Canvas, but I can also have something in addition to Canvas working together. Here's BioSig ID. This is the authentication method that we use to make sure you are you. And so anyway, there's just a lot of different additions that we can have to Canvas. So anyway, that's APIs. And I'll still discuss that a little bit more later. Okay, unit testing. Actually, unit testing, I think, is very important because I know it sounds kind of like a big deal, but it's not really. It's basically the idea that, I mean, it is a big deal, but it just sounds more complicated than it really is, because when you are creating programs or websites, you are going to be creating some sort of code or putting tags together. But especially when you're learning, or even when you're creating something big and complicated, something really long, like, you know, Microsoft Word is a program. So when you make changes, you want to test out small parts of it. And that's basically what unit testing is. So when we created that very simple HTML file, we basically did that. We created one, we tested it, and that's great. Now, later on, we're going to add to it. And so we've already tested the first part. So then we add a little bit to it. We test it out. Okay, if it works, then we can move on. So that's basically what unit testing is. You basically test small parts of it as you add them. Just, you know, it just makes your life easier, because otherwise, if you just, you know, put a bunch of code in, you think, well, and, you know, it's possible that you know all the codes that you need, and you type them all down and it works, and that's great. But when you're learning, you know, any small thing can affect your web page, and we just want to make sure that things work slowly so you don't have to deal with lots of problems, and it could just be so much more confusing if you don't. There's just so many possibilities of where the program can be. Even at some point when I create programs, I will actually remove part of the program and then test out what's left to see if it was that part that I removed or still something that's in there. So anyway, there's many different methods of debugging or getting rid of errors. Okay, so here we are in the section for good practices. And basically, you know, it's always great to do, you know, good practices and to be organized. So in this section here, they're talking about how you can be organized with the different folders that you create. So for example, I have on my computer in my documents, and to tell you the truth, it isn't as organized as it should be. But here's my Spring 2021 folder. And for Spring 2021, I really only have one class here, which is yours. But see how I have this one, it isn't even listed as a 1311 page or a file. So I would actually need to double click it to make sure which file it is. But I just happen to know because it was recent. So it's always a good idea to keep things together in their own folders. So this one right here is 1311 as well. So we'll keep it in that folder. Now this is another class. So I really should make another folder here. And then put that in there. I mean, and of course, you know, I was probably in a hurry, and that's probably why I didn't organize it, you know, as well as I should have. But it is always a good idea to do that, specifically when you are working with other people. And always remember too that, you know, even if you're the only person working on something, you might not look at code for like 6 months if you're working on, you know, a huge web page, and you know there's this one page that you really haven't seen in 6 months. When you have to look at it again, it might, you don't want to make it more difficult than it has to be. So that's why we want to do the indentations and spacing, and we'll cover that in a little bit too. But anyways, you want to be as organized as possible, and you know, just personally, you want to be organized, because when you're in a situation where, you know, maybe you're really busy or you're stressed, you do not want to make things worse on yourself. Okay, so here is the section called Pseudocode first. And it could be a bit challenging. So I actually really want you to think about and think about what I'm going to be asking in just a little bit. But pseudocode is really good because it basically helps you with the plan. And pseudocode looks similar to this. And this is a loop. So when you do something, and then you have an if statement inside of it, and then it just repeats. And to tell you the truth, I actually think the pseudocode in this textbook is a bit too complicated at the beginning. I mean, you know, they could have started a little bit easier. So I'm going to, excuse me, we're going to do that in just a little bit. And like I said, it's a way for you to plan your program. So I actually want to go onto a website real quick and show you a different method. Pseudocode is basically a list of things that's going to happen. in your program. But then there's also flowcharts that look similar to what you see on the right hand there, where you have a process, but you're actually laying out what it does, but with shapes. But when it comes to pseudocode, you are just using, sentences of what should be done. So let me show you a bit about pseudo. Okay, so let's look at pseudocode. And like I said, I think this is a bit too challenging because you don't start programming with loops and then if statements. I mean, those are parts of programming, but when you're learning programming from the very beginning, you are just going to be doing very simple things like, input and output. So that means that you can write, and we're not talking about web pages right now. What I want to talk about is like creating a program, like a C++ program or a Java program. Those are like focused programming. HTML has tags, so it's a markup language, so it's not fully programming. So let's look at what we would do when we're actually creating a program. So when you're creating a program, you're going to be creating pseudocode first just to plan it out. And when you do pseudocode, you basically want to write out the steps to do something. So for an example, and it actually is one of your questions on the quiz, for example, I want you, or at least think about what would be the very first thing that you would do? Let's go ahead and say, if you wanted to create a peanut butter sandwich, imagine right now, you're sitting here, you're watching this video, and let's say we're on break and you want to make yourself a peanut butter sandwich. What are you going to do? What's the very first step? Okay, good. Okay, gather materials. That's the very first step. What would be the next step? What is the next thing you would do if you wanted to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? Would you, okay, if you get the materials, that actually means that you are getting the bread, getting the peanut butter, you're getting the jelly, you need a plate, you need a butter knife. What else? After you get all that stuff, then what do you do? Well, the next step would be you could probably, can you put the peanut butter jelly on now? Okay, good. One option would be putting the jelly on the bread, but is the bread still in the bag? Maybe you should take out the bread first. So let's go ahead and say put the bread on the plate and then put jelly on the bread. And then what? Well, maybe put the peanut butter on the other slice. What's next? And actually, this is really, really good. And let's just say that, we didn't even think about putting bread on the plate at all. What if we didn't even think about that? Well, when it comes to pseudocode, and what is really good about pseudocode is that this is the time to just look at what you have. And so you kind of say, and you could, when you're doing pseudocode, I mean, you're not actually writing code, you're just getting it straight in your mind. So if you say, gather materials, put jelly on the bread, but you know what? Yeah, maybe I should just put the bread first. Okay, and maybe, well, before putting jelly on the bread, maybe want to take the butter knife. or hold. Okay, and then you can go back to the end and say, well, the next step would be maybe put the breads together. Okay, now is there anything missing? And I know that I didn't put this in the scope, but you know, before you gather the materials, maybe you want to open the fridge or open the cabinet. So this is a really good way of you know, organizing your code in your head before you do it. Because, and of course, you could just start writing code and just get it done. But if you have a plan, it just makes it easier, specifically because now let's go ahead and look at specifically when it comes to writing programs, because some things need to be done before other things, but you might not think about it unless you're really planning it ahead of time. So let's, for example, look at, let's say you're writing an actual program. And this program, you want to add two numbers together. Okay, so what is the very first step of adding two numbers together in a program? Okay, well, what you could do, okay, cool. Yeah, and at the very end of making peanut butter, you could say, well, now you want to put the materials to get away. You want to eat. Cool. So going back to program to add two numbers together, well, this might not be something that you're very familiar with, but because we're not there yet, we're going to be doing more programming stuff at the end of this class. But if you wanted to add two things together, you would think about, well, what do you need to do? Well, the thing that you know now is that you want to add. Okay, fine, add. Okay, so what do you need to do before adding? Well, you need to know what numbers to add. Okay, and so we're writing a program here. So what does a program need to do before or after knowing the numbers to add and then adding? Well, when it comes to programs, knowing the numbers to add is really asking for input. And you know, there's many different kinds of programs. So you can actually have a program that says that asks for the input, or you can actually initialize the numbers to add. So you might actually have a program that asks the user what numbers to add, or your program can already know the numbers to add. So it just depends on what you need to have done. So is it asking for input, or your next step is to add? And then, well, what's the next step? Okay, so we have this program here that, or we're thinking about the pseudo code to add two numbers together. So far we have that we need to know two numbers to add and then add. And we need to think about what else do we need to do. But I just want to point out that, again, you need to know what numbers to add. So you have options for programs. You can make programs do so many different things. It's all up to you. But one option would be to ask the user for input. So the user, or the person that's using your program, will say, okay, well, I want to enter 4 and 5 or in 6 or 7 or whatever they want. Or your program can say, well, it's going to add these two numbers together. And that's what initialize the numbers is. So let me actually explain a little bit about that. So if you're asking, let me just put it down here because it's not really part of our program. If you're asking for numbers, we do something like, what is first number? And this is actually what you would output to the screen. Output what is first number, and then output again what is second number. And this is actually pseudocode for writing a program still, but that's if you were going to ask for numbers. Now let's say you already knew what the two numbers were that you wanted to add in. So then you can say that number one is, whoops, number one is 2, and number 2 is 5. So in this section here, you would either ask for the input, so you would put this as the pseudocode before adding, or you would initialize the numbers to add, so you would put this before adding. Okay, so let's just say we're going to go ahead and write a program that has two numbers together. Two numbers together entered by user. Okay, and that actually is a good example of being specific. Remember that SMART acronym? If the person that wants you to write a program for them, if they weren't specific, then you wouldn't even know if you needed to ask for input or to initialize the numbers automatically. So that is a good example of needing your employer, I guess, to be detailed and specific with what they want. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to go ahead and delete that part. Now we want a program to add two numbers together entered by user. So you're going to output to the screen what is the first number. Then they're going to enter it. So you might even want to put something like accept input. Then you're going to output to the screen what is the second number. And then you're going to accept input. Then you're going to add the two numbers, and then what? So you just add them and the program's over? Well, why are you writing this program? Most likely it's because you want to display the outcome. So again, we need to be specific. We need a program to add two numbers together entered by the user and display the or display the solution screen. There. So now we're asking the user, we're adding it, and then we want to display the screen. And that would be pseudocode for the program. And of course, there may be other things that you need to do, but this is simple pseudocode. And of course, if you're creating a pseudocode for different instructors, different instructors, well, in classes, your instructor may want you to be more specific. So they might actually say, well, yes, you're accepting input, but what's the name of the variable? What's the name of the space in memory that you want to hold the input? So you might actually say, I'm going to accept input number 1, accept input number 2. And these are variables, and I'll discuss this in a little bit later. But so anyway, going back to when you're taking classes, your instructor may want you to do pseudocode that is more specific. It's all up to the instructor. But anyway, that's general pseudocode. And typically when you're doing pseudocode, it may not even be, somebody may not even see it. Like if you're working for an employer and you're creating a program for the employer is not going to say, I need to see your pseudocode. Or maybe they will want to see it. So if they don't want to see it, then it's all what you think you should do. So if you want to be more specific, then be more specific. But if nobody else is going to look at it, you really don't need it to be specific. But it's really important for you to do it ahead of time so your program will be organized from the very beginning instead of having to deal with errors or bugs. All right, so that's it for pseudocode. And so this for each right here would be considered a loop. And basically in programming, you do a loop when you want something repeatedly. Like let's say you wanted to keep on adding two numbers or adding two to a certain number over and over again, or for, for whatever reason, repeating something. Or actually, if you look at the pseudocode here, we are actually repeating what is the first number and or we're asking for a number 2 times. So that could be in a loop here, but we would just need to change a couple of things, and that's possible, but that's for another class or maybe another chapter. Anyway, there's also if statements where you can actually evaluate. So think about you could write a program that asks, do you want to add these two numbers or do you want to subtract these two numbers? If you want to add, type in an A. If you want to subtract, type in an S. And that's where the if statement comes around. So if the user inputs A, well then add them. If the user inputs S, then you want to subtract them. So that's just a and remember that this is not something that we're going to do right now. This is more focused on programming stuff. We'll be doing that kind of stuff with JavaScript later. And of course, I'll be explaining more about that programming stuff when we get there. But again, we were just focusing on how to do pseudocode. All right, so the next section is comments. So comments are just what you type in your code to describe what the code is for. So just like I've explained that, when you indent lines in your code, now let's look at, or actually, just above, we have these indentions here. We want to indent to basically make it easier to read, and that's it. All of this could be in one straight line all across the screen, but that would be really hard to read and understand what it's for. So that's why we do start on the next line, and that's why we do indentation, so it's easier to read. And why do we need it easier to read? Well, because we might not be working alone, or we might not see the code for 6 months, and we would need to interpret what that code was for again. But comments helps that even further, because you can put text in your code that isn't really code, but it's a description of what the code does. So you're not looking at this code thinking, why did I even put that in there? Why do I have this if statement? Why do I have this loop? Well, you just have a comment in your code, which is just like this here, that describes what you're doing. So this line here, we're just basically adding 2 and 2 together. Now, of course, that may be a little simple, but when it comes to, writing an entire program like Microsoft Word, you're going to need some explanations about what the code is for. And, notice how it's just in plain English. Notice how you type in some characters at the very beginning. That actually tells you that it's going to be a comment, or it actually tells it tells anybody that looks at your code, and it tells the program that you're using that it's just a comment, that it's not part of the actual program that you're writing. And I mean, program that you're using would be Notepad++, because we're using Notepad++ to write something that will run like a program. So this actually would be telling the IDE which is something I mentioned before, which is a program we use to write programs. So I know that could be a bit confusing, but IDE is later on in this chapter. I'll cover that in a minute. But anyway, comments just describe what the code is for. And it's just in plain English, but use, and this one uses 2 slashes, but different programs use different characters to determine what comments are. Okay. So order of assignment. Now again, I think this is jumping a bit ahead. Remember that this textbook, it's a free online textbook that anybody can access. But if you look at the table of contents, it is a very long textbook. They covered quite a bit, and they've covered programming, later on. So that's why they're focusing a bit more on programming stuff. But this is really not something that we're going to look at until close to the end of class. But anyway, but just know that things need to be in order. So that means, and actually, when we were writing this, just looking at this peanut butter and jelly, we talked about that. Things need to be in order. So you don't want to, put the materials away before you even create the sandwich. You don't want to, gather the materials and then put them away, because then you won't have the bread to put on the plate or to get the butter knife. So things need to be in order. And that's basically what it means, is that things just need to be in order. And in order of assignment, what that focuses on is that there are different ways of assigning numbers to variables. So let's go back to this add here. So when you add, you need a variable. And remember, I mentioned variables are like this number 1 and this number 2. These will be variables because we need to add, those two numbers together to actually get the output that we want. So here's 2 variables, and you're going to put the addition of those 2 variables into another variable called total. And then you're going to output just total. You don't need to output to the screen the number 1 and number 2. So display total to screen. So this is a variable, and notice how there's 1 equal sign here. And that does make a difference when you're doing equal signs. So when you're assigning something to a variable, like 2 plus 2 goes into temp, which is a variable, you're just using 1 equal sign. If you're checking a value, like remember I talked about if statements, if you're adding, then do this. Or if the user chooses A, then you add. If the user chooses S, then you subtract. Well, when you do an if statement like that, you're going to use 2 equal signs. But again, that's in the future, and I really don't want to focus on this part here. But also know that I am talking about variables, and variables are places in the computer's memory that will hold information. So at this point, this variable will hold 10. If we're looking at the program here, number 1 will hold whatever the user entered up here. So that you ask the user, what is the first number? They enter 5. So that 5 will be saved here in a variable in memory until you use it in your calculation to output. Okay, so let's go ahead and, okay, so that was order of assignment. You know, there's things that need to be in order, but then there's also lines that need to be in order. And this part also focuses on the fact that, notice how here it says temp equals 10, but if you put 10 equals temp, then that just won't work. It needs to be in order, not only vertically, like we did these items, but horizontally, like on the same line as well. It needs to be in order. Okay, so README, you all might be familiar with README files. Basically, it's a basic text file, and it's known for a file that nobody ever reads, but it is a file that is basically put on your computer when you install programs, and it basically tells you what the program's requirements are, how to install it, how to get help, and just information that you might need about that program is on the README file. So you might actually just want to, you know, open up File Explorer, readme.txt, and see how many readme.txt's. Oh, and I'm only looking at that spring, so I'm not going to find anything. But if I looked in my C drive and look for README, you're going to see a lot of README files. But yeah, that'll probably take forever, so I'm not going to do that. Okay, so README files just gives you information on programs when you install it. Okay, I've talked about spacing before, and you know, just like when you write programs, you know, again, you can have all of, well, this is pseudocode, but when you write a program, everything could just go all the way across the line, but it would be so hard to read, and we don't want it to be difficult. So that's why you just put spaces. You just press enter a few times. And yeah, okay, just put spaces a few times. You actually want to, like, let's say this here, okay, there's output. We're asking the user for numbers and then we're accepting it. You might actually want to put a space here because that is, you might actually call this the input area. This is the calculation area, and this is the display area. So now it's all separated, so it's easier to read. Well, you may also, remember we mentioned comments. So we might want to put a comment. This is the input area, and this is the calculation. And remember again, at some point, we are going to do a bit more programming than just this at the end of this class. But when you're writing really huge programs like Microsoft Word, it's going to take a lot of space. And so comments will be really helpful. So this is a display area. So there's your comments. You've separated the areas by spaces so that it's so much easier to read, and it's so much easier to understand what each one of those areas are. Okay, so, and now there's a section about brackets. Brackets, basically when we do HTML, we remember there was the angle bracket. Let me go ahead and do that. We have an angle bracket, then we have HTML, and then a close angle bracket. Just be very careful that you have the right bracket, because it shouldn't look like that. That would give you, well, that's a good question. Sometimes it doesn't even give you the error, but that would be a problem. Or let me go ahead and fix that. Oops. So we have your angle brackets, and then at the very end, we're going to do close.html. So just be sure that you use the right brackets, and when you're doing HTML, you use the right slash. Later on, when we do CSS, we're going to be doing colons and semicolons and curly braces, which are these here. So just be sure that you use the right characters when you need it. And the reason for them in the first place is so that the compiler is knows where the code ends and where it begins. Now, what is a compiler? A compiler, when you're writing programs, you need, because remember again that, from way back when, program or computers only understand binary. They only understand ones and zeros. So we are writing words, codes, angle brackets, but really that angle bracket is just a bunch of zeros and ones for the computer. HTML is just a bunch of zeros and ones. So that's HTML and then an angle bracket. Of course, not exactly right, but that's generally what this first line looks like to computers. So the compiler is part of the IDE, which I will cover soon, where it'll interpret what you type into binary so that the computer understands what it needs to do or what you just wrote. All right, okay, and then we have indentation. I've already mentioned that quite a bit. When something is inside something else, you want to make sure that it's indented. So we have HTML here, and when you do the body, since it's inside, you want to indent that, /body. And then we have the head, which is also inside HTML, but not inside the body. And the reason why I do spacing here is because typically there is going to be something inside the body tags, and there's typically going to be something inside the head tags. But for example, in the head tags, you might have the title tags. And this one is okay to have on the same line because there really is only going to be something in between there. And it's usually not that long too. And the title tags is basically what you see on the very top. On the browser, way up on the top, you see that this tab says employee alamo.edu. So whatever you type in this title tag is going to be up there, employee, and then -alamo.edu. That is going to be in the title tag in the browser. But anyway, back to the topic. Indentations tells you what is inside something else, and it just makes it easier for you to read or anybody else that's going to see your code. All right, and so here's an illustration of those things that they talked about. Here's some spacing. PHP is another programming language that allows you to interact or to pull information from that database and display it onto the screen. But we're not going to be covering that. So, and then there's curly braces here. There's an open and there's a close. And then here's the PHP tag, and here's the close PHP tag. Going to the spacing, to tell you the truth, I don't think that's completely necessary unless you know there's something going to be up there. Here's a tab, so that means this echo hello world is inside of this function here, and there's the curly braces. So there's stuff inside of it. And then we have your comments to the screen, those two forward slashes. And remember, comments are just information to the programmer that's reading the program, what this line or whatever section is all about. And I know that I've mentioned tags before. HTML is a markup language. It's not really a programming language. So all of these with the angle brackets, they're considered tags. Okay, meaningful variable names. Now, remember earlier I was talking about the pseudocode. Pseudocode here. And let me go ahead and just space out just so that we can focus on just the one area. Okay, so this is the pseudocode. Now remember I asked, what is the first number? Number 1. What is the second number? Number 2. When you create variables, you could actually call them whatever you want. George and I don't know, Stumpy. So you could call the variables whatever you want, but it needs to make sense, because now when you go into the calculations, you have George, you're going to add George and Stumpy. And you can make this variable to say Alaska, if you could spell right. Okay, so it could be Alaska, but see, the problem with that is that then it would just be harder to use the variables later on. And also it's harder to understand what the variables are for. And again, you know, somebody else looking at this code or you 6 months from now, it's just not going to make a lot of sense. So it's always a good idea to make sure that these variables here are named appropriately. Or at least it means something. Okay, versioning is pretty important too, I say. Even when you're writing, you may still want to do versioning. And basically what that is when you're, I would say when you're doing a lot of things with computers, you know, even if you were to create a graphic or an animation, maybe you're doing graphics animation, you want to save at some point when you know what you're doing is good, but then you're gonna maybe test something else and you're not sure about it. We'll save that first one as version 1, and then you can save it again as version 2 and then make your changes. So let's say you messed up version 2, well, you can always roll back to version 1. And that's always a good idea, especially when you're doing something that you're not too familiar with, or, you know, you're learning it. So versioning is really good, you know. So you might have lab 1 version 1, lab 1 version 5, you know, lab 1 version 7, you know. It's safer that way. Otherwise, you might have to start all over again. Okay, GitHub real quick. We're not really going to cover that. It's just a cloud service and it helps with working versions. And there's so many other things you can do with that, but we're not really going to do that. Okay, and now we're in this section. We're almost done actually with the chapter. Development tools, many different things that you can use to develop your web pages or programs or whatever. And here's just a couple of them that can help you write your code. So there's something called frameworks, and it actually has a bunch of code that you can actually use quickly. And yeah, I'm really not going to focus on that because we're not going to use it, or at least a lot of these we're not. Smarty is a place where you can get templates. Templates are basically code that you can use over and over again. So when you create a really big website for a company, and, you know, basically the website has to look the same. You know, here's the website for our for Canvas. You know, if you click a link and all of a sudden this menu is on the right hand side here, or maybe it's on the top, that it just doesn't make the website like a cohesive site. It just looks like you're going to a different website. It needs to generally look the same no matter where you are within that one website. So so you want to use a template when you're creating big websites. Now for this class, we've already created lab 1, so you already have the basic code, this HTML head, body, and HTML. You could actually use that lab 1 as a template. So at this point, you just have your name here, and of course you need to indent. You have your name there, but now after we've already done that, we might want to put more stuff now. So we're going to have more in our web page. So what you have for lab 1, you can go ahead when you're ready for lab 2, You can just do File, Save As, save it as Lab 2, and then do your changes. So that's what a template is, and Smarty has templates. Okay, and we do cover templates later, but I generally already covered that. This one just reduces SQL statement writing, which is always helpful because, well, of course, right now you're learning, and I don't want you to use code that's already created. I want you to create your own code. That's the way to learn. And yes, I'm going to go ahead and rewind a bit and say, there are programs out there that will create the code for you. So you might be thinking, well, why are we learning how to make this code in the first place if it does it for you? Well, there are so many times when even though there's something that creates it for you, it's still not going to do it right. There's always going to be errors. So you always have to be able to go back into the code and fix something. Even when it comes to Canvas here, like when I create these pages here, you know, it's just text here and that's great. But there has been times where I actually need to look at the code, and actually I'm going to edit it. And here's the week 2 contents, but actually way on the bottom right-hand corner, it has the HTML editor icon. So if I click that, this is the page in HTML. So now I can fix it if there was something wrong with the link. And even though there's buttons on top that where you can make things bold and all that stuff, sometimes there's just instances where it just doesn't work. And I've actually had to help fellow instructors out because things just looked bad, and not everybody knows how to do HTML. And so that's just not something that's very common, but very, very helpful. So not only would you need to do it for websites or web pages that you're creating for an employer, there's other times where you might want to. And then I'm not sure if you've ever used Myspace, but Myspace was a website with like communication like Facebook, where you could actually, if you knew HTML, you could make changes to it. Your page was different than everybody else's because you could make changes. Okay. Okay, so anyway, I kind of went off on that one. But HTML, I'm sorry, SQL, I wanted to throw out real quick is structured query language, which is generally another programming language. And having code already written instead of having to create it yourself is so much easier than, well, again, creating it yourself. Okay, Zen Framework, that's something, you know, much more powerful. Typically, companies use that. Templates again, basically it's like an outline of what your site is going to be. So you don't have to, you just have one version and you just use it over and over again, just like this. This, your lab 1 can be a template where you use for every assignment. So you don't have to type in HTML head and body over and over again. And I would actually recommend that. As long as you remember, maybe for lab 2, maybe you don't want to do that because I need you to make sure to remember. And so many times I get where people will put the head inside the body, and that would be wrong. So to get used to the fact that head is above body and then inside HTML, once you know that for sure, then you can go ahead and start using previous labs for templates. Okay, here's something else available. Bootstrap, created by Twitter. So many things like forms and buttons, they're already created and you can just use their code. Foundation is for responsive web design. But again, I know that said that you can use it, but you can't use it for this class. You can't use any of this code for class. And frankly, a lot of it would be just too much for you at this point. Focus on what's in the textbook, in this textbook. Foundation, again, responsive web design. And basically responsive web design is where, websites, if you go on computers, the website looks great. And then when you use your cell phone, your cell phone is much smaller, but somehow it still looks okay. Well, that's because of responsive web design. So basically it resizes or even eliminates some of the items on the page, like graphics or animations, just so it looks okay on your cell phone. Previously, what we used to have to do is create a second version of the entire website for mobile devices. But since we started using responsive web design, it's it's not so much work. You don't have a whole different website to create. And we'll be covering responsive web design a little bit more later on, but unfortunately we won't be actually creating one for an assignment. Okay, integrated development environment. This is something that I've mentioned quite a bit. Basically, the IDE is an editor where you can actually write your code. So that means that Notepad, which is what we're using now, is an IDE. It's a place where you can write your code. And if it were a programming language like Java or C++, it would give you the ability to compile it. And compiling, remember, it means to make text that we write into binary so the computer understands what we wrote and runs it. So here are some IDEs. And like I mentioned, here's Notepad right there. That's a link to what we're using now. If you wanted to do Java, there's JEdit. There's Bluefish for markup languages and programming. Text Wrangler. It highlights syntax, which is really the code, just like a lot of other IDEs do. One thing that's different about it is that it has FTP within the editor. So that means not only can you edit and possibly compile, but you can also upload the file, because this is file transfer protocol. You can also upload the file into the website once you know that it's good. And you can do that within the software. Not all of them do that. HTML kit is another one for writing HTML, XML. Remember XML we covered before? It has user-defined tags. So it's not body HTML. You can put whatever you want to call it in XML files. Extensible markup language. Okay, APIs. I mentioned it earlier. Remember, we were looking at Canvas, and you can integrate Zoom within Canvas. You can integrate so many other things like YouTube. You're adding it to Canvas. So Canvas is a site on its own, but it's actually allowing another program to work with it. So that's generally APIs. And there's some more about it. And then it also talks about Google Maps, where you have websites that have a map within that website. So you're not really at Google, you're at their site, but you're still looking at a Google map. So more about that. And we are done with chapter 6.